My husband left his empire to me. My stepson sued, saying I was an uneducated housewife who manipulated him. He hired the best lawyer in the city to destroy me. When I walked into the courtroom, the opposing lawyer turned pale, dropped his briefcase, and bowed. It's really you. I can't believe it. My stepson had no idea who I truly was. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Marka. I am 67 years old, and today I learned what it feels like to be called just a housewife in a courtroom full of strangers. The morning started like any other since Richard died 6 months ago. I made my coffee in the ceramic mug he gave me for our 15th anniversary. I sat at the kitchen table where we had shared 20 years of breakfasts and tried to ignore the silence. The house felt too big and too quiet, filled with memories that comforted me and hurt me at the same time. Then the doorbell rang. A young man in a cheap suit handed me an envelope. He was polite, too polite. Mrs. Stone, legal documents. You'll need to sign here. My hands shook as I read the papers. Trevor, my stepson, was contesting Richard's will. He claimed I had manipulated his father into leaving me everything. The words undue influence jumped off the page. Gold digger. Opportunist. A woman who took advantage of an old man. I sat down in Richard's leather chair, the one he used every evening to read the newspaper. 20 years of marriage. 20 years of caring for him and our home. And this was how it ended. The courthouse smelled like old wood and disappointment. I walked through the marble halls in a simple navy dress, the same one I wore to Richard's funeral. I held my purse tight as if it could protect me. Every step echoed, making me feel smaller. Trevor was already there, sitting at a polished table that probably cost more than my car. He wore an expensive suit and that smirk I had known for years. Next to him sat his lawyer, Jonathan Pierce. Everyone knew his name. $300 an hour. The best money could buy. I had no lawyer. I couldn't afford one, not without using the inheritance Trevor wanted to take from me. All rise, the bailiff said. Judge Hamilton entered. He looked serious, experienced, tired. Pierce began speaking. His voice was smooth and confident. Your Honor, we are here because an innocent man's final wishes were twisted by a calculating woman who took advantage of a lonely widower. My stomach dropped. He called me a predator. He said I married Richard after a suspiciously short courtship. That I had no children, no career, no income of my own. She was nothing more than a housewife, he said, like it was an insult. Trevor leaned back, smiling. I remembered making Trevor pancakes when he was young, helping with homework, sitting through school plays where he pretended I wasn't there. Pierce continued. He said I isolated Richard from his son, that I controlled him, that I secured my place as the sole heir to an estate worth $8.5 million. Judge Hamilton asked for evidence. Pierce talked about phone records and neighbors. He said I discouraged Trevor from visiting. What he didn't say was that Trevor only came when he wanted money. That those phone calls were me begging him to come home when his father was dying. How do you prove love in court? Pierce waved his hand toward me. This is a classic case of elder abuse, he said. A woman with no education beyond high school and no real skills. Then Trevor spoke. She's just a housewife, he laughed. Look at her. She probably doesn't even understand my father's assets. The room went quiet. Judge Hamilton looked at me. Mrs. Stone, do you have a lawyer? No, Your Honor. I'm representing myself. And your response? My throat was dry. How do you explain 20 years of love in legal words? I loved my husband, I said. Everything I did was to care for him. I never asked for his money. Trevor laughed again. That's why you married a man 23 years older than you. I married him because he was kind, I said. Because he respected me. Because he showed me what real love was. Pierce said he had witnesses. A neighbor who heard me talking about the will. Mrs. Chin. She had seen me crying after Richard's diagnosis. Afraid of losing him, not his money. The judge adjourned the court for the day. He advised me to get a lawyer. As everyone left, I stayed seated. Trevor and Pierce laughed together like they had already won. I felt crushed, reduced to nothing. But something inside me woke up. Something I had buried for 20 years under dinners, errands, and quiet support. That night, I sat in Richard's study. Law books lined the walls. Photos from our travels surrounded me. Our life felt fragile, like it could be erased with lies. I poured a glass of wine and whispered, "Just a housewife." But I wasn't always just a housewife. I remembered who I was before I stepped back, before I chose love and family over status. The phone rang. A reporter. Then another. I unplugged the phone. Upstairs, I looked at myself in the mirror. Gray hair. Simple clothes. I looked exactly like what they said I was. But Trevor didn't know my past. Pierce didn't either. They thought they were fighting a helpless widow. They were wrong. But when I opened the jewelry box on my dresser to put away my wedding ring for the night, my fingers touched something else. Hidden beneath the velvet lining was a small key I had forgotten about. It was the key to Richard's desk drawer, the one he always kept locked. For emergencies, he had said when he gave it to me years ago. For when you need to remember who you really are. I never understood what he meant. Until now. Back in the study, my hands shook with fear and anticipation as I slid the key into the lock. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside was a manila folder labeled, Marcia, Personal. My breath caught. Inside were documents I had not seen in 20 years. My law degree from Harvard. Summa cum laude. Newspaper clippings from my early career. A photo of me being sworn in as the youngest Superior Court judge in the state's history. Letters from powerful legal figures whose names still carried weight in courtrooms across the country. At the bottom was a handwritten note from Richard. My dearest Marcia, I know you sacrificed everything to build a life with me, but your talents were never wasted. They were only sleeping, waiting for the day you would need them again. You are the strongest and most brilliant woman I have ever known. Don't let anyone, not even our son, convince you otherwise. All my love. Richard. The tears came fast and hot. Richard had known. He had always known who I truly was and what I had given up for love. He had protected that truth, saving it for the moment I needed it most. Before I became Mrs. Richard Stone, I had been Judge Margaret Stone for 15 years. I handled major civil cases, corporate disputes, and criminal trials that made headlines. Lawyers feared my courtroom. They called me the Iron Judge. Then I met Richard at a charity event in 2003. He was newly widowed, raising 12-year-old Trevor alone. He didn't know who I was professionally. To him, I was just Marcia, the woman who made him laugh again. For the first time, something mattered more than my career. I chose love. I chose family. I retired early and quietly stepped away from the legal world. I became a wife, a stepmother. I spent 20 years supporting Richard, running our home, attending school events, and putting my own past behind me. I told myself it was worth it. But sitting there in that study, surrounded by proof of who I once was, I felt something burning inside me. Not just anger, memory, power. I opened my laptop and did something I had not done in 20 years. I researched case law, inheritance disputes, undue influence, burden of proof. My fingers moved easily, like they remembered what to do. The law had changed, but the foundations were the same. And Trevor's case was weak. Very weak. Pierce had emotion, not evidence. No proof of coercion. No medical records showing diminished capacity. No witnesses to wrongdoing. Sympathy doesn't win cases. Evidence does. I read through Richard's papers as a lawyer, not a wife. The will was solid, properly signed and witnessed. His medical records showed no mental decline. His financial advisor's notes clearly explained why Richard chose to leave everything to me. Then I found Richard's private journal. Page after page spoke of love, gratitude, and disappointment in Trevor's behavior. The last entry stopped me cold. Marcia doesn't know I found her old courtroom photos. She thinks she gave up everything for me. She has no idea how proud I am of her. If anything happens to me, Trevor will try to hurt her. But Marcia is stronger than she knows. She will surprise everyone. I closed the journal and looked around the study. This place wasn't just Richard's. It was mine too. Tomorrow, I wouldn't walk into that courtroom as a helpless widow. I would walk in as Judge Margaret Stone. The next morning, I wore the same navy dress. But I stood taller, walked steadier. Trevor and Pierce were already there, confident and relaxed. Pierce looked bored, like the outcome was guaranteed. Judge Hamilton entered, and this time I noticed his precision, his posture. He reminded me of young lawyers who once stood nervously before me. Pierce called his first witness, Mrs. Elizabeth Chun. My neighbor took the stand. She avoided my eyes. Pierce questioned her gently, guiding her words. She testified that Trevor rarely visited, that I was frustrated, that she found me crying 2 months before Richard died. She repeated my fears about what would happen after he was gone. Pierce smiled and sat down. The judge looked at me. Mrs. Stone, do you wish to cross-examine? Yes, Your Honor. I stood, calm, focused. I approached Mrs. Chun. You said I was crying that day. Why was I crying? Because Richard was dying. What had I just learned that morning? The doctor said the treatment wasn't working. He had about 6 weeks. I paused. Was I crying because of money? Or because my husband was dying? Because he was dying, she said quickly. And when I said I was scared, was I scared of being poor? Or scared of being alone? She swallowed. You said you didn't know how to live without him. I nodded. No further questions. The courtroom was silent. Judge Hamilton leaned back in his chair, studying Mrs. Chun for a moment before dismissing her. She stepped down quickly, her face pale, avoiding Trevor's eyes as she returned to her seat. The damage had been done. What Pierce thought was his strongest moment had cracked under a few simple questions. Pierce stood again, his confidence shaken just enough to notice. He called 2 more witnesses, a former housekeeper and one of Richard's distant business associates. Both repeated the same vague claims. I was protective. I handled everything. I spoke for Richard when he was tired. I listened quietly, taking notes, letting them talk. By the time Pierce rested his case, the room felt different, less certain, less impressed. Judge Hamilton turned to me. Mrs. Stone, you may present your case. I stood, slowly, deliberately. Thank you, Your Honor. I felt Trevor watching me, confused now, that smirk slipping just a little. I would like to submit several documents into evidence. I handed copies to the bailiff. Richard's medical records, his will, statements from his financial advisor, his journal. Pierce stood. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Judge Hamilton raised an eyebrow. Overruled. Continue, Mrs. Stone. I nodded. Richard Stone was of sound mind until the day he died, I said calmly. These medical records show no diagnosis of dementia, no cognitive decline, and no medication that would impair judgment. I turned slightly toward Trevor. His will was updated 3 years before his death, witnessed by 2 independent parties and notarized. At that time, his relationship with his son was already strained. Pierce crossed his arms, watching me closely now. Next, I continued, I would like to call Richard Stone's financial advisor, Mr. Leonard Hale. There was a flicker of surprise on Pierce's face. He hadn't expected that. Mr. Hale testified clearly. He explained Richard's concerns about Trevor's spending habits, his repeated requests for money, and his lack of responsibility. He confirmed that Richard made the decision freely and thoughtfully. He loved his son, Mr. Hale said, but he didn't trust him with money. Trevor shifted in his seat. Then I held up the journal. This, I said, is Richard's private journal from the final months of his life. I ask permission to read a short excerpt. Pierce objected again. The judge allowed it. I read only what mattered. Richard's love, his clarity, his fear that Trevor would try to hurt me. When I finished, the courtroom was silent. I looked at Trevor for the first time since standing. You say I isolated your father, I said evenly. But these entries show he begged you to visit, that he waited for your calls, that he was hurt when you didn't come. Trevor stood abruptly. That's not fair. Sit down, Judge Hamilton said sharply. I took a breath. And now, I said, I would like to address the claim that I am just a housewife. Pierce stiffened. 20 years ago, I continued, I retired early from a legal career, not because I was incapable, but because I chose family. I chose love. That choice does not erase who I was or what I know. I paused, then said quietly, before I was Mrs. Stone, I was Judge Margaret Stone. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Pierce froze. Judge Hamilton straightened in his seat. Slowly, he looked at me again, really looked at me. Then his eyes widened. Judge Stone, he said carefully. I nodded once. The color drained from Pierce's face. He dropped his pen. Papers slipped from his hands and scattered across the floor. He stood abruptly, bowed his head slightly and said, It's really you. I can't believe it. Trevor turned to him, stunned. What are you talking about? Pierce didn't answer him. He couldn't take his eyes off me. I appeared in her courtroom, he said quietly. Years ago. The room buzzed. Judge Hamilton exhaled slowly. That explains a great deal. I continued, my voice steady. I did not manipulate my husband. I supported him. I did not isolate him. I protected him. And I did not steal from him. He chose me. I turned back to the judge. The burden of proof lies with the plaintiff. They have presented no evidence of coercion, abuse, or diminished capacity. Only resentment. I sat down. The judge called a brief recess. When we returned, Judge Hamilton didn't hesitate. After reviewing the evidence, he said, This court finds no grounds to invalidate Richard Stone's will. The claim of undue influence is dismissed. Trevor stood. That's it? He was my father. And this was his decision, the judge replied firmly. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck. Pierce packed his briefcase in silence. Trevor stared at me, disbelief written across his face. You planned this, he said as I passed him. I stopped. No, I said gently. You did. I walked out of the courtroom with my head high. The whispers followed me, but they no longer mattered. Outside, the sun felt warm on my face. For the first time in months I could breathe. I wasn't just a housewife. I never was. The hallway outside the courtroom felt brighter than it had that morning. Reporters waited near the doors, microphones raised, cameras ready. I stopped for a moment, then walked past them without saying a word. I had spent enough of my life being explained by others. I didn't owe anyone a statement. Outside, the air was cool and clean. I stood on the courthouse steps and closed my eyes. Richard should have been there. He would have smiled that quiet, proud smile of his and squeezed my hand. I could almost feel it. Behind me, I heard hurried footsteps. Mrs. Stone. I turned. It was Jonathan Pierce. Up close, he looked smaller than he had in the courtroom. Tired. Humbled. I owe you an apology, he said. His voice was careful. I should have recognized you sooner. I never would have taken this case if I had known. I studied him for a moment. You would have taken it anyway, I said calmly. You didn't lose because of who I used to be. You lost because you didn't have the truth. He nodded, accepting that. Still, he said, it was an honor to see you work again. He stepped aside, letting me pass. Trevor stood a few feet away, alone now. No lawyer, no supporters, just anger and confusion. This isn't over, he said bitterly. I looked at him, really looked at him. He wasn't a villain. He was a wounded boy trapped in a grown man's body. It is over, I said gently. For me, he scoffed. You took everything. No, I replied. Your father gave it to me, and he would have given you something far more valuable if you'd let him. His time. He had no answer. I walked away. That evening, I returned to the house. The silence no longer felt suffocating. Felt peaceful. I made tea instead of wine and sat in Richard's study again. But this time I didn't feel haunted. I felt grounded. I opened my laptop and began answering emails I had ignored for years. Old colleagues, former clerks, judges who had once served beside me. Word travels fast in legal circles. Is it really you? One message read. We heard you were back. If you ever consider consulting, teaching, mentorship, I smiled. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to choose between who I was and who I loved. Richard never asked me to disappear. I had done that on my own. The next morning, I visited the cemetery. I placed fresh flowers by Richard's grave and sat on the bench beside it. You were right, I said softly. I had forgotten. A light breeze moved through the trees. I felt calm. Over the following weeks, the noise faded. The media